The morning in New York City was draped in a persistent silver fog that rolled off the Hudson River, a somber pallid that Sarah Thompson, at 27 years old, tried desperately to interpret as a sign of mystery rather than a dark omen. Standing before the full-length gilded mirror in the sacristy of St. Patrick's Cathedral, the reflection staring back at her felt like a beautiful ghost. Her wedding dress, a structural masterpiece of ivory silk and hand-stitched French lace that had consumed 3 years of her savings as a high-end interior designer, felt less like a garment of celebration and more like a silken cage. Sarah had spent 30 months meticulously planning every micro detail of this day. The specific vibration of the organ pipes as they filled the Gothic nave. The exact olfactory profile of the white lilies she had flown in from the Netherlands. And, most importantly, the look of adoration she expected to see in the eyes of David Miller when she finally reached the end of the aisle. David, a ruthless assistant district attorney with a jawline carved from marble, and an ambition that often felt as cold as the city, as concrete, was the man she believed to be her predestined partner. Together, they were the golden couple of the Manhattan, social, column Z, visionary designer, and the relentless legal eagle. But now, as the heavy mahogany clock on the wall ticked past 45 minutes of delay, David's legendary precision began to feel like a calculated weapon aimed directly at her heart. Beyond the massive oak doors, the murmuring of the congregation had shifted from a hum of festive anticipation to a sharp, electric vibration of morbid curiosity. Sarah could hear the muffled sound of sharp metallic laughter and the rhythmic clacking of high heels against the marble floors 300 of New York. Essely leaned into one another to trade venomous theories about the missing groom. David's family, led by the formidable matriarch Margaret Rodriguez, occupied the front row with a terrifying stillness, as if they were presiding over a public execution rather than a holy union. Margaret had never veiled her disdain for Sarah, a woman she viewed as a mere aesthetic distraction, from a mid-sized town in Ohio who had no business mingling with their prestigious legal lineage. Elizabeth Jones, David's jealous cousin, was already hunched over her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she live-blogged to the collapse of the ceremony to her thousands of followers who were starving for a scandal involving the city's most famous prosecutor. I always knew David would regain his senses. Sarah overheard a whisper snake through the sacristy door, a phrase that chilled her blood more effectively than the winter draft. The air in the cathedral felt as though it were being siphoned out. Sarah felt the corset of her gown tightening against her ribs until every breath became a conscious act of defiance against her own panic. Michelle Lee, her maid of honor and best friend since their days at design school, paced the room with a face that grew paler with every passing minute avoiding. Sarah's eyes, like they were a sun she couldn't bear to look at. The silence in the sacristy was interrupted only by the deafening, mechanical heartbeat of the clock and the distant sound of the organist repeating the same soft melody, in a loop that now sounded like a funeral. David wasn't answering his calls. But Sarah knew Davy, he didn't just handle details. He dominated them. And if he wasn't there, it was because he had decided that he no longer wanted to dominate their shared future. The final collapse of her world arrived through a short, brutal vibration in Michelle Lee's hand. Michelle looked at the screen, and her eyes filled with an instant, drowning pity. Without a word, she extended the phone to Sarah. No mention of their 4-year history. No apology for the apartment they had just signed for, or for Sarah's parents who had spent their retirement savings to host this event. Just a hollow echo of absolute cowardice. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her satin heels. The world lost its sound and color, leaving only a static hum in her ears, as the reality of her rejection hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She was the jilted bride, the woman who had waited nearly an hour for a ghost, becoming nothing more than cheap entertainment for people she once called friends. The tears began to burn the back of her eyes, threatening to destroy the flawless makeup that had taken 3 hours to apply. When she realized that several guests had cracked open the sacristy doors to witness her disintegration, cell phone flashes began to fire like a firing squad. She was a spectacle, a Greek tragedy in ivory silk. It was at this exact moment of total eclipse that a figure emerged from the back of the church near the side entrance. James Smith, a 31-year-old firefighter, was standing there as a last-minute guest of one of the groomsmen. Having come directly from a commendation ceremony for the FDNY, James was still wearing his dress, blues a crisp, navy blue uniform with gold buttons that caught the light filtered through the stained glass, his medals of bravery pinned to his chest. He watched the scene with a rigid jaw and eyes that burned with a quiet, dangerous indignation. James Smith had spent his life running into burning buildings to save strangers facing the absolute worst of humanity, while others fled, and seeing the gratuitous cruelty of that New York crowd against the vulnerable woman ignited a protective instinct in him that he could not suppress. He saw the predatory satisfaction in Margaret Rodriguez's eyes. He saw the camera of Elizabeth Jones aimed at Sarah's devastated face, and he felt something inside him snap. Without a shred of hesitation, James walked down the center aisle. Each step of his polished boots echoed like a thunderclap in the cathedral that had now fallen into a confused silence. His imposing physical presence, marked by broad shoulders and a natural command, forced the gossips to recoil. He ascended the altar steps with an unshakable determination, stopping inches away from Sarah Thompson. His scent was a mixture of cedarwood and the crisp air of the city, a vital, real contrast to the suffocating smell of dying lilies. James leaned forward, ignoring the stunned priest and the crowd that was holding its breath. His eyes, deep and calm as the ocean after a storm, fixed onto Sarah's icy brown eyes, which were shimmering with unshed pain. He didn't ask for permission. He offered a rescue. "They're here to see a tragedy, Sarah," he whispered, his voice a firm baritone that seemed to vibrate inside her chest, anchoring her to the earth. "But you aren't going to give them that. You're going to walk out of here like a queen, not like a victim David Miller discarded. Trust me. Pretend I'm the groom." Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process the insanity of the proposal. She didn't know his name or his voice, but she saw in the eyes of this stranger an honor and a courage that David had never demonstrated. The crowd began to murmur louder. Someone let out a mocking laugh at the back of the hall. It was the final push. Sarah reached out a trembling hand, and James Smith gripped it with a firmness that promised he would never let her fall. He turned to the priest and, with the authority of someone commanding a rescue unit, declared that there had been a necessary delay for official service reasons, but the ceremony would proceed under his protection. The exit from St. Patrick's Cathedral was not the reverent, peaceful transition Sarah Thompson had imagined for months, but a whirlwind of blinding lights, aggressive shutter clicks, and a murmuring that seemed to vibrate through the very stone walls. James Smith led her with a natural, unforced authority, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back, providing a singular anchor in a sea of absolute chaos. As they walked toward James's heavy-duty FD&Y response truck, parked imposingly where David Miller's rented limousine should have been, Sarah felt the eyes of 300 elite guests burning into her neck. The drive to the Fairmont Hotel in the heart of Manhattan was submerged in a dense silence, broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. She stared at the gold band on her finger, a ring James had pulled from a chain around his neck, an object that seemed to carry an emotional weight she didn't yet understand. James drove with surgical precision, his eyes focused on the road, but his jaw remained tight with indignation for what he had witnessed. She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. James didn't look away from the traffic. "In this city, Sarah, I spend my days pulling people out of rubble and facing fires that consume everything they own. What I saw in that cathedral was a fire of a different nature, one that consumes the soul and dignity." Upon arriving at the Fairmont, the ostentatious luxury of the ballroom felt like a cruel joke. Sarah had spent nearly 2 years designing every detail of this reception, from the orchid arrangements that cost a small fortune to the amber-toned lighting meant to create an atmosphere of eternal romance. Now, she was walking into that arena hand in hand with a stranger, prepared to stage the greatest lie of her life. In the elevator, Sarah tried to wipe away the tears that threatened to smudge her makeup. James stopped the elevator between floors, a gesture that startled her for a second, but it served to give her a moment of absolute privacy. He held her shoulders with a surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were accustomed to heavy rescue gear. "Sarah, look at me. Out there, the world wants to see you fall apart. They want you to be the victim of David Miller's cowardice. But in here, you're the woman who decided her life is worth more than the opinion of mediocre people. If they ask, we were a secret, an old flame that came back to reclaim his place. Let me handle the cynics." The double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the master of ceremonies, visibly confused but professional enough not to falter, announced the couple under a rain of hesitant applause. Manhattan's elite was David Miller had been replaced by an official in dress blues who exuded a virility and honor that the ex-groom never possessed. During dinner, James sat at the head of the main table, acting with unshakable calm. Sarah watched the way he handled the fine silverware and the sharp questions from the guests. Elizabeth Jones, David's poisonous cousin, approached with venom distilled in every word. Questioning the convenience of this sudden appearance, James did not flinch. He responded with a baritone voice that silenced the entire table. Some stories need to be explained to those who understand loyalty. Ms. Jones. The comment was a masterstroke, transforming David's abandonment into a trade-up in the eyes of society. The most critical moment was the first dance. Under the Swarovski crystal chandeliers, James pulled Sarah to the center of the floor. She was rigid, fearing any touch would reveal the sham. However, as the soft melody of a string orchestra filled the air, James began to lead her with an unexpected grace. "You dance quite well for a firefighter," she commented, trying to ease the tension. James gave a half-smile that lit up his gray eyes. "My mother insisted a man should know how to save lives and how to lead a lady on a dance floor." Sarah felt the heat of his body through the silk layers of her gown. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to be the perfect partner for an ambitious man. She felt protected, as if there were an invisible wall between her and the judgment of the world. James's scent, a mixture of pine soap and something reminiscent of fresh rain, began to replace the suffocating smell of the lilies in her memory. However, reality began to take its toll when notifications on Sarah's phone wouldn't stop. David G. Miller, hiding in some hotel in the outskirts, was furious. Sarah felt a chill. They had signed the documents at the church in the heat of the moment and legally before the state of New York. She and James Smith were now husband and wife. What had started as a rescue act now had massive bureaucratic and legal ramifications. James noticed the change in her expression and, without needing words, led her to a discreet balcony. "Far from curious eyes and cell phone flashes?" James asked, his voice now carrying a contained danger. Sarah showed him the messages. "He says this is fraud." James Smith let out a short, humorless laugh. "David can try whatever he wants, Sarah. But he forgets I deal with fire every day. A cornered prosecutor doesn't scare me. But you need to decide what you want." Sarah looked at the New York skyline, with its bright lights and icy indifference. She looked at James, the man who had risked everything for her in less than 3 hours. Sarah's internal conflict was devastating. She felt a gratitude that bordered on adoration, but also the fear of taking advantage of a stranger's nobility. Furthermore, there was a spark emerging there, something that wasn't feigned, something born of trauma and mutual protection. James wasn't just a shield. He was starting to be the first man she truly saw, without the lens of social ambition. The night ended with a silent promise between the two. James accompanied her to the bridal suite, but instead of entering, he stopped at the door. "I'll stay on the living room sofa. Sarah, no one enters here without passing me." Sarah held his hand for a second longer than necessary. "Thank you, James." He simply nodded and closed the door, leaving her with her thoughts and the weight of the dress that now seemed to represent not an end, but a strangely promising beginning. She realized her life would never be the same, and that the random firefighter who had saved her from the ashes of humiliation now occupied a space in her mind that David Miller had never managed to fill in 4 years of dating. The story of Sarah and James is at a crucial point where the public lie begins to create deep roots in the hearts of these two strangers. If you're re-enjoying this narrative of courage and want to see how this fire wedding will end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your presence here strengthens our community and motivates us to bring stories that remind us that honor still exists in the most unexpected places. Turn on notifications to be the first to know what happens next. Now, I'd like to propose a reflection for you. If you were in Sarah S.'s position, what would you do upon receiving messages of regret and threat from your ex-fiancé that same night? Would you give in to fear or trust the stranger who extended his hand? Leave your comment with your opinion or a personal experience of overcoming. We love reading what you think about these real-life moral dilemmas. The dawn over the Hudson River brought a ruthlessness that seemed to expose every lie told the previous night. But for Sarah Thompson, the light brought a different kind of clarity. She woke up in the immense bed of the Fairmont bridal suite, and for an instant, the weight of abandonment tried to crush her again. However, upon leaving the room and finding James Smith asleep on the sofa, still in his dress blue trousers, but with his white shirt half open, she felt a wave of security she had never experienced with David Miller. James woke up at the sound of her footsteps, in a state of alertness typical of someone waiting for a fire alarm. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse from sleep. David didn't show up. Sarah sat in the armchair opposite him. "James, we need to face reality. We signed those papers. Legally, we are married before the state of New York." James stood up and walked to the window, watching the morning traffic. I spoke with my captain last night. He's a good man and understands emergency situations. I told him the truth, Sarah, that I acted to prevent an emotional disaster. He told me that as long as there's no crime, the department won't punish me for having a heart. But David Miller is another story. At that moment, Sarah's phone rang. It was David. But this chimmy Sarah didn't feel her stomach churn with fear. She felt a cutting coldness. She answered and put it on speakerphone. David was screaming, his voice distilled with an arrogance that now seemed pathetic. Sarah, sign the annulment papers now. If you don't, I'll sue this firefighter hero of yours for every penny he has. You think you can humiliate me like this? Sarah looked at James, who remained motionless, with a glimmer of contempt in his gray eyes. She took a deep breath and responded with a voice she never knew she possessed. David, you left me at the altar in front of 300 people. You weren't humiliated by me. You humiliated yourself when you proved to be a coward. And as for James Smith, he did in 3 hours what you couldn't do in 4 years. He protected me. If you want to fight in court, go ahead. She hung up and felt absolute liberation. James approached, and for the first time he held her hands, not for a performance, but from a genuine desire for closeness. You were incredible, Sarah. But you know what that means, don't you? If we don't annul for fraud, we'll have to go through the divorce process, and that will take time. Sarah looked at James's ring on her finger. And what if it isn't a lie, James? James fell silent for a long moment, the intensity of his gaze making Sarah Essie's heart race. I'm not the man you planned for, Sarah. I don't have a corner office or a 7-figure bank account. Sarah smiled, a real smile that lit up her tired face. James, I've spent my life designing perfect interiors for empty people. I don't want planned perfection anymore. I want something real. The legal resolution of the marriage ended up being the least of their problems. Sarah and James decided to keep the union not out of obligation, but to see where that connection would lead them. They moved to a smaller house, far from the excessive luxury that David Miller valued so much. Sarah discovered James was a terrible cook, but a wonderful storyteller. And James discovered Sarah had a willpower that could move mountains. James's nephew, little Tyler Collins, became the center of Sarah's world, filling a maternal void she didn't even know existed. David, on the other hand, saw his career stagnate when the story of the cowardly groom became an urban legend in New York, damaging his image of trust before juries. 6 months after that fateful day at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Sarah and James returned to the church, but this time the doors were closed to the public. There were no photographers, no Margaret Rodriguez with her looks of contempt, no Elizabeth Jones with her phone at the ready. There were just the two of them, Michelle Lee and James's captain as witnesses. The same priest, now smiling with a deep understanding of life's irony, performed a vow renewal ceremony. This time, Sarah didn't wear a designer ivory silk, but a simple summer dress, and James didn't need to whisper to save her. He spoke loudly so the universe could hear his real commitment. The lesson Sarah Miller took for life was that destiny often knocks down our houses of cards so we can build something on a stone foundation. She was left at the altar to be found in the ashes by a man who faced fire by profession and soul. Their love wasn't born from a social contract or a class convenience, but from an act of pure, selfless bravery. Today, when the sirens echo through the streets of New York, Sarah no longer feels fear. She feels pride, knowing her husband is out there being someone's hero, just as he was and always will be her hero. This journey of Sarah and James comes to an end, but the message that honor and true love can emerge from the darkest moments remains with us. We hope the story has brought a little warmth and hope to your day. If you felt the emotion of this new beginning, I invite you to become an official member of our family here on the channel. Your subscription is what allows us to continue transforming life scripts into narratives that inspire thousands of people. Welcome. Now, a special question to wrap up. From which city and country are you following our stories today? Write in the comments below. We love knowing how far our voice is reaching. And tell us, did you like Sarah's ending? What part moved you the most or made you reflect on your own life? Your feedback is a gift to us. Until the next story, with hearts full of new possibilities.